The Velthari Palace sat at the top of a crystal mountain on a planet where the sky was always purple. It was beautiful in the way that cold things are beautiful, perfect, untouchable, and a little bit cruel. The halls were tall and quiet, and the people who walked through them wore silk robes and carried old names like weapons. Princess Seraphine walked those halls every day, and every day she felt like she was walking in a place that had never truly decided to accept her. She was half Velthari. Her mother had been human, a diplomat, kind and warm and full of laughter. Her father had been a Velthari lord, serious and proud, who had loved her mother quietly and deeply until the day she died. Seraphine had her mother's brown eyes and her father's silver-white hair. She was beautiful in a way that confused people, because she didn't look like she fully belonged to any world. The court had never let her forget that. They smiled at her face and talked behind her back. They called her the half-blood princess. They said she was too soft, too human, too emotional. They allowed her a seat at formal events because her father had been powerful, but they never gave her a real voice in anything that mattered. The only place Seraphine had ever felt fully herself was in a small workshop on the lower level of the palace. A messy, cluttered room filled with tools and half-finished machines, and the smell of engine oil. That was where she had met Ethan Cole. He had come to the palace 2 years ago as part of a human engineering team sent to upgrade the palace's environmental systems. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was always slightly too long and hands that were always slightly dirty. He had no title, no noble family, no political value whatsoever. He was just a man who was very good at fixing things. He had also been the first person in the palace who talked to Seraphine like she was a normal person. Not a princess, not a political symbol, not a half-blood oddity, just a person. They had argued about the correct way to reroute a power conduit on their second meeting. He had been wrong. She had told him so. He had laughed a real, warm laugh and said she was right. That was it. That was how it started. They married 8 months later in a small ceremony that the court had attended with polite expressions and private disgust. A princess marrying a human commoner. A half-blood making an even worse choice. High Sovereign Dravith, Seraphine's uncle and the ruler of the empire, had said nothing against it publicly. He had simply looked at Ethan the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that has been placed in the wrong room. Ethan had looked back at him with calm, steady eyes and said nothing. That had been 2 years ago. Now the empire was in trouble. The Kethoran Dominion had been pressing at the borders of Velthari space for 6 months. They were an old and powerful empire, larger than the Velthari, crueler in their methods and deeply traditional in ways that made other civilizations uncomfortable. They had a ritual. When they decided to absorb a neighboring empire peacefully, or what they called peacefully, they demanded a tribute. 1 life, always 1 life of noble blood. It was their way of saying, we are stronger than you and you know it. It was their way of making an empire bend its knee without firing a single shot. Civilizations that refused the tribute got a war instead. Most chose the tribute. The Velthari court met for 7 days behind closed doors. Seraphine was not invited. She sat in her quarters and felt the silence of the palace grow heavier each day, the way clouds grow heavy before a storm. On the 8th day, High Sovereign Dravith summoned her. The throne room was full of lords and advisors. They all stood very still, very straight, the way people stand when they have already made a decision and are simply waiting to announce it. Dravith sat at the center of the room in his tall chair, his crystal spine catching the light, his face smooth and unreadable. He told her what they had decided. She was to be the tribute. Seraphine stood very still while he spoke. She heard every word. She understood every word. The empire had looked at her and done the math. She was noble enough to satisfy the Kethoran requirement, but half-human enough that no one in the court would truly grieve her. She was the perfect sacrifice because she was the one they could most easily afford to lose. She did not cry, she did not argue. She asked one question: how long would the peace last? Dravith said 10 years, possibly more. She nodded once. She said she understood. The court exhaled. She walked back to her quarters slowly, keeping her face calm the entire way. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed in and out, slow and steady, until the shaking in her chest stopped. Then she heard the door, and Ethan was there. He had heard. The palace had ears and people who liked to use them, and word traveled fast. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her. He looked the way he always looked, steady, present, his dark eyes taking everything in, but there was something behind his eyes tonight that she had never seen there before. Something very quiet and very deep, like water that has gone still right before it freezes. She crossed the room and put her hands on his face. She made him look at her. She told him it was going to be all right. She told him that she had made her choice. She told him that billions of people would be safe because of this, and that was worth something, worth more than one life, even her own. She told him that she needed him to be okay. She needed him to keep living, to keep building things, to keep laughing the way he laughed, because she was going to carry that laugh with her wherever they took her. She told him not to grieve. He looked at her the whole time she spoke. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. When she finished, he brought his hands up and covered hers where they rested on his face, and he held them there for a long moment without saying anything. Then he kissed her forehead. He held her through the night. In the morning, he was still beside her when she woke. The Kethoran delegation arrived at noon, 6 of them, tall and armored in dark metal, their faces hidden behind ceremonial masks. They moved through the palace like a slow tide. The court received them with formal grace, the kind of grace that is really just well-dressed fear. Seraphine walked to them herself. She did not let them come to her room. She dressed in white, her choice, not theirs, and she walked down the long hall with her head up and her spine straight, and she looked like every inch a princess. Ethan stood at the edge of the corridor and watched her go. She did not look back. She had decided not to. If she looked back at him, she would not be able to keep walking. The delegation took her aboard their ship. The ship left the atmosphere. The Velthari court went back to their business. The Empire exhaled. Ethan Cole turned and walked alone into the throne room, past the guards, past the advisors, past every polished and powerful person in that hall. He walked until he stood in front of High Sovereign Dravith's throne, and the room went very quiet. He looked up at the man who had sold his wife to buy a peace deal, and he said 7 words in a voice that was perfectly calm. "You just made the last mistake you'll ever make." The room was silent for 1 full second. Then the guards grabbed him and dragged him to the lower cells, and the court went back to assuming that was the end of it. They were wrong. They were so completely, catastrophically wrong. But they would not understand that yet, not for a few more days, not until the Empire started to quietly come apart at the seams, and the man they had locked in a cell below the Crystal Mountain was nowhere to be found. The cell they put Ethan in was deep underground, below the Crystal Mountain, where the walls were cold stone and the air smelled like metal. It had a single light on the ceiling, a solid door with no handle on the inside, and a small vent in the upper corner that pushed recycled air into the room every 4 hours. The guards had taken his jacket. They had left him his boots, his pants, and a gray shirt that was too thin for the cold. They had not taken anything else because they had not thought there was anything else worth taking. He was just a human, a commoner, a man who had said something foolish in a throne room and would spend a few weeks in a cold cell thinking about it. That was what they believed. What they did not know, what no one in the Velthari palace had ever bothered to learn, was that Ethan Cole had spent the last 2 years memorizing every system in that building. Not because he planned any of this, not in the beginning. He had started simply because he was an engineer, and engineers look at systems the way other people look at landscapes. They notice things. They remember things. They quietly store information about how everything connects to everything else, not because they need it right now, but because someday they might. He had memorized the environmental systems when he upgraded them. He had memorized the power grid when he ran new conduits through the East Wing. He had memorized the communication relays when he helped install the backup arrays on Sublevel 3. He had done it all with his hands and his eyes and his very quiet, very patient mind, and he had never told anyone because no one had ever thought to ask. He sat on the floor of the cell for about 40 minutes. Then he stood up, walked to the vent in the upper corner, and got to work. The vent cover was held in place by 4 fasteners, a Vilthari design, very elegant, made from a crystalline alloy that was hard and beautiful, and as it turned out, slightly brittle at very specific pressure points. Ethan had helped design the environmental systems in this sublevel. He knew the material. He pressed his thumb against the lower left fastener at the exact angle required, applied steady pressure for about 20 seconds, and felt it give with a soft crack. He did the other 3 in under 3 minutes. The vent shaft was narrow. Vilthari bodies were slender. A Vilthari engineer had designed this shaft, and they had never once considered that a broad-shouldered human man might need to fit inside it. Ethan spent a very uncomfortable 40 minutes proving that the gap between impossible and extremely unpleasant is mostly just stubbornness. He came out on Sublevel 2 in a maintenance corridor that the palace staff used once a week and ignored the rest of the time. He found a technician's cabinet with a gray uniform inside. It fit well enough. He found a communication terminal at the end of the corridor, a basic model, not high security, used for routing maintenance requests. He sat down, typed for 11 minutes, and sent one encrypted message. It went to Earth's Interstellar Council. The message contained a simple text header and one attached file. The header said, "Act on this, now." The attached file was large, very large. It was everything Ethan had quietly documented over 2 years of living inside the Vilthari court: trade route maps, fleet deployment schedules, names of lords who were in private debt, details of political alliances that the Empire pretended did not exist, 7 different supply chain vulnerabilities, the location of 3 Vilthari military installations that were not on any public record. He had not been building a weapon. He had just been paying attention. But paying attention, it turned out, was sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could do. He sent the message, stood up, and walked to the Eastern Service Corridor, where a supply tunnel connected to the outer edge of the mountain. 72 hours after he had been thrown in that cell, Ethan Cole walked out of the Vilthari Palace's outer service exit into the cold night air of Valethais Prime, wearing a borrowed uniform and carrying nothing except what was in his memory. He disappeared before the morning shift came on. The palace did not notice for 6 hours. When they did, there was a great deal of controlled panic dressed up as formal concern. The guards searched the cell. They found the open vent. A senior officer stared at the broken fasteners for a long time, then looked at his subordinate and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. A message arrived on High Sovereign Dravith's private console 2 hours after the disappearance was confirmed. It was short. "I told you." Dravith read it 3 times. He then called his senior military advisor and told him to find Ethan Cole. Immediately, the advisor nodded and went to organize a search. He did not find Ethan Cole. Nobody found Ethan Cole. But they started noticing other things. On the 7th day after Seraphine was taken, 3 Vilthari cargo haulers reported mechanical failures simultaneously. Failures in systems that had all been recently upgraded by human engineering teams. Investigation showed the failures were not accidents. Someone had quietly rerouted power in ways that looked normal until they didn't. Each failure happened in a different star system, far apart, and each one was completely unconnected on paper. On the 9th day, a Vilthari communications relay in the Myerth sector went offline. The backup relay also went offline. 3 minutes later, technicians traced the problem to a software update that had been pushed through 6 weeks earlier, buried inside a routine maintenance patch, authored by an account that did not officially exist. On the 11th day, the human workers and engineers embedded throughout Velthari space, thousands of them, spread across dozens of systems, doing quiet work that no one considered important, began to move. Not dramatically, not violently. They transferred to different stations. They changed shift rotations. They relocated equipment for what looked like ordinary reasons. But they moved in a pattern, the way birds move just before a storm, individually sensible, collectively purposeful. A junior intelligence officer noticed the pattern first. She brought it to her supervisor with a report that was 3 pages long and very carefully worded. Her supervisor looked at the report. He looked at the map of human worker movements. He looked at the timeline of the cargo failures and the relay outages. He put it all together slowly, the way a person assembles a picture they wish they weren't seeing. He went directly to the High Sovereign. Dravith listened to the full report in silence. When it was finished, he sat back in his chair and said nothing for a long moment. Around him, his senior generals and advisors stood in a loose circle, waiting. One of his generals, a decorated commander named Verash, who had fought in 4 wars and never lost, spoke first. He said what everyone was thinking. It was one human, an emotional, irrational civilian. The failures were probably coincidental. The worker movements were probably unrelated. They should not waste military resources chasing a grieving commoner around the galaxy. The room nodded. The room agreed. Except for one man in the corner, an old advisor named Sulith, who had served 3 sovereigns and spent 40 years studying alien civilizations. He had not nodded. He had been standing very still since the junior officer's report began, and now he looked up from the floor and said, quietly, that he disagreed. He said he had been studying human history for a long time. He said that humans had a pattern, a very specific, well-documented pattern, of performing their most remarkable and terrible things not when they were strong and organized and ready, but when they were angry and had nothing left to lose. He said he thought they should find Ethan Cole very quickly. He said he thought they should be afraid. The room did not listen to him. The room had its own logic, its own certainty, its own comfortable belief that the galaxy worked the way the Velthari understood it to work. Somewhere in the dark between stars, a single human ship powered up its engines for the first time, and a man with steady eyes and dirty hands looked at the star charts and began to plot a course. He was not angry. Anger burns hot and burns out. What Ethan carried was colder and steadier than anger. It was purpose, and it had no off switch. The galaxy had no word for what was coming. It would have to invent one. Calyx Station sat in the dark at the edge of a system no one visited anymore. It had been built 20 years ago as a deep space refueling point for human mining operations. When the mines ran dry, the company that owned it quietly stopped paying its maintenance fees and equally quietly stopped telling anyone it still existed. It was not on any current Velthari star chart. It barely appeared on human ones. It was just a small, cold station floating in the dark, forgotten by everyone. Almost everyone. Ethan had found it 3 months after arriving at the Velthari Palace, during a routine survey he had volunteered to help with. He had logged its coordinates in his private files, filed no official report about its condition, and said nothing about it to anyone. He had simply noted it, the way he noted everything, and filed it away in his memory under useful. He had gone back to it 7 months later, on a personal leave he said he was spending with human friends on a nearby colony. No one checked. No one cared where the human engineer spent his days off. He had started building. Not all at once. Not obviously. He had taken old parts that were logged as discarded, components that had been signed off as waste. Equipment that existed on no current inventory because it had technically been written off. He had made 17 trips over 2 years. Each one looked like nothing. Each one added something. What sat in Calyx Station's main hangar now did not look like a warship. It looked like someone had taken a mining vessel, heavy-bodied, industrial, graceless, and rebuilt its insides 3 times over. The hull was thick in ways that Velthari engineers would have called wasteful. The engine configuration was doubled, then doubled again, with redundant systems stacked on top of redundant systems in a way that broke every principle of elegant design. The weapons, and there were weapons, had been built from mining equipment, modified with patience and precision, and a very deep understanding of what makes things explode and in which direction. It was not beautiful, it was not elegant, it was not refined. It was the most human thing Ethan had ever built. He called it Prometheus. He arrived at Calyx Station on a short-range shuttle 3 days after walking out of the Velthari Palace. He was cold and tired and had eaten almost nothing for 2 days. He sat in the hangar for a few minutes with his back against the ship's landing strut, looking at the floor, letting himself feel the full weight of everything, Seraphine's hands on his face, her voice telling him not to grieve, the sound of the Kethoran ship leaving the atmosphere. He gave himself those few minutes. Then he stood up, rolled his sleeves, and started the pre-launch checks. His crew arrived over the next 20 hours. They came in 1s and 2s, on different ships from different directions, the way the message he had sent them instructed. 6 people in total. His former colleague Dara, who was the best pilot he had ever seen, and who had once flown a damaged shuttle through an asteroid field to save a mining crew, and then complained afterward that the shuttle's controls were poorly designed. Dr. Myra Solon, a xenobiologist who had been Seraphine's closest friend and had cried for an entire day when she heard what the court had done, then dried her eyes and started asking how she could help. 3 engineers, Jin, Rook, and Amma, who had all worked with Ethan at various points, and who trusted him in the specific, bone-deep way that people trust someone who has never once panicked in a crisis. And 1 more, an older man named Sergeant Briggs, retired Earth military, who now did private security consulting and who had, when he received Ethan's message, packed 1 bag and been at a transit port within 2 hours. None of them were soldiers. None of them were heroes. They were ordinary people who knew Seraphine or knew Ethan or both, and who had decided, each in their own way, for their own reasons, that ordinary people sometimes have to do extraordinary things because there is no one else to do them. They launched on the 2nd morning. Ethan stood at the front of the bridge and looked at his crew and told them the truth. He told them the Kethoran tribute fleet was 4 days away at their current speed. He told them what they were flying into. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not make promises he could not keep. He said they were going to get Seraphine back, and that he intended to make the Kethoran Dominion understand, in terms they could not misinterpret, that they had made a serious mistake. Dara asked how many ships were in the tribute fleet. Ethan said 11. She was quiet for a moment. Then she cracked her knuckles and said she had worked with worse odds. Nobody disagreed. They got to work. 4 days in deep space gave them time to prepare. Ethan and the engineers modified 3 of Prometheus's mining charge launchers into something closer to torpedo tubes. Dr. Solon cataloged everything she knew about Kethoran ship design from her research files, their sensor ranges, their communication frequencies, the materials their hulls were made of. Briggs ran combat simulations until he had every attack angle memorized. Dara flew test maneuvers in the empty dark that made everyone grip their seats and trust her completely. On the 4th day, they found the tribute fleet. 11 Kethoran vessels, sleek, dark, and angular, built for ceremony as much as combat. They moved in a formal formation, slow and confident, the way powerful things move when they are not expecting trouble. Their long-range sensors would have picked up Prometheus by now. Ethan knew that. He was counting on what they would see. A heavy, industrial-looking ship of human origin, rated as non-military, approaching from a non-threatening angle. The Kethoran Threat Assessment System classified them as a civilian vessel with anomalous power readings. A flag was noted. A decision was made to hail them before taking action. The hail came through on the bridge speakers. A Kethoran officer, voice flat and formal, demanded identification and stated that the area was restricted space under Dominion authority. Ethan leaned forward and spoke into the comm. He said, "I know, I'm here for my wife." 3 seconds of silence. Then Prometheus dropped its power core limiter, and every system on the ship came fully alive at once. And Dara slammed the throttle to maximum, and they hit the tribute fleet like a fist. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not a space battle in any traditional sense. It was not two organized forces following doctrine and strategy. It was one human crew operating on instinct, improvisation, and a profound personal motivation, against 11 ships whose crews had never once needed to react to something they had not anticipated. The first 2 Kethoran ships lost their engine system to a modified mining charge that Ethan had tuned to detonate at a specific electromagnetic frequency, the same frequency the Kethoran ships used in their drive cores, because Dr. Solon had found that detail in a research paper 3 nights earlier. The third ship tried to maneuver, and Dara cut across its bow at a distance that should not have been physically survivable, disrupting its navigation sensors with Prometheus's engine wash. Ethan routed coolant pressure from the ship's secondary system into the forward emitters and used it to disable 2 more ships' external arrays. It was not a weapon anyone had designed. It was a solution to a problem, found in the moment, using what was available. Jin burned out his console rerouting power, and Amma took over without being asked. Rook fixed a hull stress fracture with his hands, and a tool that was not technically the right tool, because the right tool was on the other side of the ship, and there was no time. Briggs ran the point defense systems and hit every incoming projectile. Dara did not crash, not once, not even close. In 11 minutes, 7 of the 11 Kethoran ships were disabled, not destroyed, but unable to move or fire. The other 4 had pulled back to a safe distance and were transmitting emergency signals in every direction. Ethan opened the fleet-wide comm channel. He broadcast on all frequencies, in the 3 most common languages spoken in Kethoran space. He said, "I'm coming for my wife. Anyone in my way is a problem I will solve." He closed the channel. The bridge was quiet except for the sound of cooling systems and Rook swearing softly at the hull patch. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. They all looked at the disabled ships around them and then at Ethan, and he looked back at them with steady eyes. "Good work," he said. "Set course for Kethsar." Somewhere on those 11 ships, Kethoran crew members were sending reports to their commanders. The reports were confused, detailed, and deeply alarming. The commanders who received them read them twice and forwarded them up the chain with notes attached. Every note said some version of the same thing. This should not have been possible. They were right, it shouldn't have been. It was anyway. Prometheus jumped to FTL and vanished into the dark, headed deeper into Kethoran space, toward a fortress world that no enemy had ever once breached in 300 years of Dominion history. There was a first time for everything. Kethsar was a dark planet. Not dark the way space is dark, empty and cold and indifferent, but dark the way old, deliberate things are dark. Its sky was a deep, bruised red even in daylight, because of the particular composition of its upper atmosphere. Its buildings were made of black stone that had been quarried from its own mountains and carved into shapes that were meant to make visitors feel small. Everything on Kethsar was designed to communicate one idea. We have been here longer than you, and we are stronger than you, and you are here because we allow it. It was the ritual world of the Kethoran Dominion. It was where tributes were brought. It was where the High Conclave met to witness the ceremonies that told the galaxy who held power and who did not. It had orbital defense platforms in 4 rings, 42 platforms in total, each one armed well enough to hold off a small fleet. It had a surface garrison of 6,000 soldiers. It had shield generators buried under the mountains that could power up in under 30 seconds and withstand sustained bombardment for weeks. It had never been attacked in 3 centuries of Dominion history because no one who had ever looked at what it would take simply decided it was worth trying. Seraphine had been on Kithsar for 5 days. She had been given a room, not a cell technically, but a room with no handle on the door and no windows that opened. It was large and cold and furnished with Kethoran pieces that were clearly considered luxurious. She had not touched most of them. She sat on the floor near the door for the first 2 days because she found the stone cold in a way that kept her present, kept her sharp, kept her from going somewhere dark in her own head. She was not broken. She had decided not to be. It was a decision she had to remake every few hours, which was exhausting, but she kept making it. She thought about Ethan. She let herself think about him because not thinking about him was worse. She thought about his hands and his voice and the laugh that started slow and then took him over entirely. She thought about the look in his eyes when she had said goodbye, that still, cold look, like water before it freezes. She had told him not to grieve. She hoped he had listened. She suspected he hadn't. On the 5th day, the planet's orbital defense network began screaming. Not an alarm in the room, the building itself changed. She felt it before she heard it, a vibration in the floor, then a distant concussive sound, then multiple sounds layering over each other. Boots in the corridor outside. Voices, sharp and fast. The particular quality of organized panic that tries very hard to sound like organized competence. Seraphine stood up from the floor. She walked to the door and pressed her ear against it. She could hear fragments, Kethoran officers relaying status reports, numbers she couldn't fully make out, references to orbital platforms 1 and 3, something about an unclassified vessel that was not responding to hails and was currently violating the 3rd defensive ring. She stepped back from the door. She sat on the edge of the cold bed and pressed her palms flat against her knees, the way she had sat in her quarters the night they told her she was going to be the tribute. She closed her eyes. She knew exactly who it was. She had told him not to. She had held his face in her hands and told him to keep living, to not throw his life away, to let her go. She had been so clear. She had been so certain. She pressed her eyes shut tighter and breathed. She should have known better. She had known him for 2 years. She had argued with him about power conduits and married him in front of a court full of people who thought it was a mistake and spent every day since then grateful that she had. She knew how he worked. She knew how his mind ran. She knew that when he looked at a problem, any obstacle, anything in the world that was wrong, his entire self became focused on fixing it. She was, apparently, a problem he intended to fix. Ethan, she thought, with a feeling that was equal parts terror and love, and something she could not name at all. Outside, the sounds got louder, then they got closer. The crew of Prometheus had been studying the schematics of the ritual complex on Kethsar for 4 days in FTL, using every piece of information Dr. Solon could pull from academic research papers on Kethoran architecture, and a set of building plans that had been published in a diplomatic exchange 30 years ago and never recalled. They were not perfect plans. They were missing whole sections, but they were enough to form a plan. The plan went wrong in 4 places. The first was the 3rd orbital platform, which had a faster recharge rate than the published specs indicated. Dara had to take Prometheus through a gap that was technically 6 meters narrower than they had calculated, and she did it without flinching and without slowing down, which Rook later said was the most frightening thing he had ever witnessed. The second was a sealed corridor on sublevel 1 that was not on any map they had. Ethan and Briggs encountered it and spent 40 seconds figuring out an alternative route, which put them 2 minutes behind schedule. The third was a security response team of 12 soldiers that appeared from a direction none of them had anticipated. Briggs handled most of that. He was 61 years old and retired, and he handled it in a way that suggested retirement had not diminished him in any meaningful capacity. The fourth was Ethan. His path to Seraphine's wing took him through a room where a senior Kethoran officer was working. The officer was large and trained and fast. Ethan was not a soldier. He had never claimed to be one. He won anyway, because he was also very stubborn, and because he had grown up in a mining colony where physical disagreements were not uncommon, and because he did not know how to stop when something mattered. He found the door to Seraphine's room. He had a device. Jin had built it from repurposed components that cycled through door frequencies until it found the right one. It took 40 seconds. They were the longest 40 seconds of Ethan's life. The door opened. She was standing right there, 2 steps back from the door, as if she had known to be ready. She looked at him, his damaged pressure suit, the cut above his eye that had bled and dried, the state of him in general, and she was quiet for a long moment. "I told you not to do this," she said. "I heard you," he said. She waited. "I disagreed," he said. She crossed the room and put her arms around him without another word, and he held her so tightly that she felt the tension in his whole body, the daze of it, all the held breath and controlled focus releasing all at once, and she let him, and she held him back just as hard. They did not have long. The Kethoran High Conclave arrived in the corridor behind them 40 seconds later, 12 members of the Dominion's ruling body, surrounded by 40 honor guard soldiers, and with them, the supreme arbiter of the Kethoran Dominion. He was ancient by any civilization's measure, tall and still, with eyes that had seen centuries of history, and processed it all into a very particular kind of cold intelligence. He looked at Ethan Cole. He looked for a long time. Then he spoke in clear common tongue and a voice like deep stone. "What manner of creature are you?" He did not mean it as an insult. He was genuinely asking. His voice had the quality of someone encountering something that does not fit into any of their existing categories and is trying to build a new one from scratch. Ethan stood in front of Seraphine, one hand back to keep her slightly behind him, and he looked up at this ancient and powerful being and said, quietly and simply, "The kind that loves her." The arbiter was still. The honor guard had their weapons raised. Briggs was somewhere to the left. Dara was back on the ship keeping Prometheus ready. They were completely surrounded. There was no angle here that made sense. There was no path that looked survivable. And then, from above the planet, every sensor on Kethsar lit up at once. Velthari warships, a full military formation, 7 vessels dropped out of FTL in high orbit. Not Ethan's allies. They had come for Seraphine too in their own way, not to save her but to retrieve her, to take her back, to restore the peace deal that one human man had apparently decided to destroy by attacking a Kethoran fleet and invading a fortress world alone. 3 factions in one place at the same moment. The Velthari demanding the tribute be honored. The Kethoran holding the tribute on their own soil. And Ethan Cole, standing between all of it, with a cut above his eye and a damaged suit and one hand back keeping his wife safe. The arbiter looked at him again. Something shifted in those ancient eyes, slow, like tectonic movement. He looked at Ethan the way a person looks at a piece of evidence that changes the conclusion they had already drawn. The honor guard still had their weapons raised. Ethan did not step back. He breathed slow and steady and kept his eyes on the arbiter and did not step back. Above the planet, the Velthari and Kethoran fleets were exchanging formal hails. Below, on the surface of a world that had never once been breached, one man waited to see what the universe was going to do. He had played every card he had. He had nothing left to play. He held his ground anyway. That was the most human thing about him. That was the thing the arbiter was looking at and slowly beginning to understand. The corridor was very quiet. 40 honor guard soldiers with weapons raised, 12 members of the High Conclave in their ceremonial robes, the Supreme Arbiter, tall and still, looking at one human man who had no weapon in his hand and no army at his back and absolutely no intention of moving. Above the planet, 7 Velthari warships and what remained of the Kethoran tribute fleet were exchanging formal transmissions. Both sides wanted Seraphine, for different reasons. Both sides considered the situation on the ground to be secondary, a loose end to be handled after the political question was resolved. Neither side had thought to ask Ethan Cole his opinion. The Arbiter had not moved. He was studying Ethan the way a scientist studies something unexpected, not with hostility, but with deep, careful attention. He had lived long enough to understand that things that did not fit into existing categories were either very dangerous or very important, and that the most significant ones were usually both. He had read the reports from the tribute fleet, 7 ships disabled by 1 vessel in 11 minutes. He had read the reports from his security teams about the breaches in the orbital platforms, the bypassed shield corridors, the sealed doors that had been opened anyway. He had read the description of the fight on Sublevel 1, where one aging man had gone through 12 trained soldiers like they were furniture. All of it done by 6 ordinary people, nobody military, nobody enhanced, nobody with special equipment or superior technology, just people who had decided something needed to be done and had found ways to do it. The Arbiter had conquered 43 civilizations in his lifetime. He had taken their tributes. He had watched them bend. Some had cried. Some had argued. Some had sent champions who fought well and lost because the Dominion's champions always fought better. Every civilization in the end had accepted the reality in front of them. The Kethoran were stronger, and strength was what the universe ran on. He looked at Ethan Cole and thought about this for the first time in several centuries. He spoke. His voice was very measured, very slow. He said that he had presided over many tribute ceremonies. He said that in all those centuries, no individual from any civilization had ever done what this human had done, not because no one had cared enough, but because every civilization, everyone had operated on the same fundamental logic, that some losses must be accepted, that when power speaks, it must be obeyed, that the gap between what is right and what is possible is a gap that cannot be crossed. He said he had believed, until today, that this logic was universal. He looked at Ethan and said, "What is the limit of what you would do?" It was a genuine question, not a threat, not a test. He actually wanted to know. Ethan looked back at him for a moment. Then he said simply, "I don't know, I haven't found it yet." The Arbiter was quiet for a long time. Around the corridor, none of the honor guard moved. The conclave members stood very still. The building continued to hum with the noise of the situation above, the Velthari and Kethoran fleets, the communications, the competing demands. Then the Arbiter did something that no one in that corridor, perhaps no one alive, had ever seen him do. He lowered his head very slightly, not a bow, something smaller and more private than a bow, an acknowledgement. He told his honor guard to lower their weapons. He turned to the conclave and said that the tribute was withdrawn. The room went so quiet that Seraphine, standing behind Ethan with one hand on his shoulder, could hear her own heartbeat. The withdrawal of a tribute demand had not happened in Kethoran history. Not once. It was not done because it could not be done. There was no rule against it. It simply never happened because the Dominion did not reverse itself. Revering itself meant admitting something, and the Kethoran did not admit things. But the Arbiter was old enough not to care about that. He was old enough to know the difference between strength and stubbornness. He was old enough to understand that what he had just witnessed was a data point he could not afford to ignore. He had looked at the numbers. One human with 5 companions, no military training, and a repurposed mining vessel had disabled 7 ships and breached Kethsar. This had been done for one person. Specifically, one person. The Kethoran dominion had expanded for centuries on the reliable premise that every civilization had a breaking point, and that you could find it by taking something they valued. If that premise did not apply to humans, if humans responded to loss not by breaking but by doing this, then the Dominion's entire model of conquest became unreliable, and the Arbiter had not lived this long by being unreliable. He told the Velthari fleet, via direct communication, that the tribute was withdrawn on grounds of procedural reassessment. He used a formal Kethoran legal mechanism that was technically valid and had not been invoked in 200 years. It was airtight. Nobody could argue with it, though several people would try later. The Velthari fleet went very quiet. High Sovereign Dravith, on the bridge of his flagship above the planet, received the message and read it twice. He then looked at his senior officers. His officers looked at the floor because they were not sure where to look. One of his generals said, quietly, that this was because of the human. Dravith did not respond. He sat in his chair and thought about a man who had come into his throne room alone and said 7 words, and whom Dravith had dismissed as irrelevant. He thought about the cargo failures, the relay outages, the intelligence file that had reached Earth's Council, and which his own intelligence service had intercepted a copy that revealed how thoroughly his empire had been quietly mapped by a man he had considered furniture. He thought about the fact that the Kethoran Dominion, which had never surrendered anything to anyone, had just withdrawn a tribute demand because of 1 human and 5 ordinary people in a mining ship. He did not say anything. He ordered the fleet to hold position and began composing a very careful diplomatic communication to Earth's Interstellar Council, because he was many things but he was not stupid, and he could feel the political ground shifting under his feet. On the surface of Kethsar, in the corridor with the lowered weapons and the very still soldiers, Ethan took Seraphine's hand and they walked out. The honor guard let them pass. The conclave moved aside. The Arbiter watched them go, and there was something in his ancient face that might, in a certain light, have been called respect. Prometheus picked them up from the surface 20 minutes later. Dara brought the ship down in the only clear space available, which was technically a courtyard not designed for landing, and she put it down so smoothly that not a single stone cracked. When Ethan came up the ramp and onto the bridge, the crew looked at him, and then at Seraphine behind him and then back at him. Nobody said anything heroic. Dara turned around and started calculating the FTL jump home. Jin started running system checks. Rook, who had a long cut on his arm that he had not mentioned to anyone, sat down and found the medical kit. Dr. Solon took Seraphine's hands and held them for a long time without words. Briggs looked at Ethan and nodded once. Ethan nodded back. They went home. In the weeks that followed, the Galaxy had a great deal to say. Diplomats gave speeches. News channels ran stories. Academics wrote papers. The human incident on Kethsar was analyzed from every angle by every civilization that had a reason to care, which turned out to be most of them. A Kethoran scholar named Arbith Voss published a paper in the Dominion's Journal of Behavioral Sciences. She had spent 3 weeks reviewing every piece of data available on the incident, the fleet engagement, the planet breach, the testimony of the honor guard, the Arbiter's own recorded account. She had run it all through the Dominion's standard models for predicting individual behavior under stress. The models failed. Every one. They could not account for the scope of what Ethan had done, because they were all built on the assumption that individuals have limits of capability, of endurance, of willingness to sustain cost in pursuit of a goal. They had been built on the study of every species the Dominion had ever encountered. They had not been built on the study of humans. Arbith Voss wrote in her conclusion that the data suggested humans operated with a variable she had no existing term for, a multiplier that appeared to engage when a human individual formed a strong personal attachment to another individual, and which appeared to have no observable upper limit. She proposed a name for this variable, translated roughly from the Kethoran as the human constant. Her paper was read widely. It was discussed in military councils and diplomatic offices across 12 star systems. Several civilizations quietly updated their threat assessment protocols regarding humanity. The updates did not change the official classification. Humans were still listed as a mid-tier species with limited territorial reach and no significant military projection capability. But someone in a back office of at least 7 different galactic intelligence services added a handwritten note to the human species file. The notes were all different, because the note writers were different people with different languages and different ways of thinking, but they all said some version of the same thing. Do not give them a reason. On Prometheus, 3 days into the journey home, Seraphine sat with Ethan in the small room at the back of the ship that served as their quarters. She was looking at his hands, the cuts and bruises on his knuckles, the burn mark on his right palm from a console that had shorted, the general evidence of what the last 2 weeks had cost him physically. She traced the bruises with her thumb. "You're irrational," she said softly. He looked at her. "Yeah." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside the small porthole, the stars moved in the way they move at FTL, not like points of light but like long, soft lines of color, pulling toward them and past. She thought about what she had asked him to do. She thought about what he had done instead. She thought about billions of people safe because she had been willing to be the tribute, and then she thought about the arbiter's face when he had withdrawn the demand, and she was no longer certain that the math she had done, one life for billions, was the only math that was possible. Maybe it never had been. Maybe she had just not known what variables to account for. "Don't ever stop," she whispered. He pressed his cheek against the top of her head and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The ship moved through the dark, through the long lines of stars, carrying 6 ordinary people home. In the intelligence files of a dozen civilizations, a new note sat beside the human species entry. No big predictions, no dramatic proclamations, just a quiet reminder written by careful hands that had looked at the evidence and drawn the only logical conclusion. Threat level incalculable, motivation dependent. Do not harm what they love.